This is the story of Ruby Bridges, podcast by Alexia Iwamoto
and Abigail Spoonhoward.
Ruby Bridges is framed in history as the first African-American elementary student to desegregate an all-white school in the southern United States. But what led up to this pivotal event? How did it impact her and those closest to her? And how is she doing today?
In 1954, in the case Brown v. Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal education was inherently unequal, and therefore ordered the end of racially segregated schools. In 1959, 9 black high school students enrolled in a white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. This group, dubbed the Little Rock Nine, was an integral part of ending segregation in schools in Arkansas, but in many places, schools stayed segregated. In New Orleans, desegregation wouldn't be seen for another 3 years. Due to the blatant refusal to willingly desegregate, the federal court gave the city of New Orleans a deadline for school integration, September of 1960.
On September 8, 1954, in the same year as the Brown v. Board of Education case, Ruby Nell Bridges was born. She came into the world as the eldest of 5 siblings to Aban and Lucille Bridges at a small hospital in Tylertown, Mississippi. The Bridges family lived with her paternal grandparents, who were Mississippi sharecroppers. In 1958, when Ruby was 4 years old, like many people at the time, Ruby's family moved to New Orleans to seek better job opportunities in the city. During the summers, Ruby would work with her cousins and maternal grandparents, who were also Mississippi sharecroppers, while her parents stayed in New Orleans to work.
When Ruby started kindergarten, she was not allowed to attend the school 5 blocks from her home. She had to walk many blocks to the nearest school for black children. In Ruby Bridges' book, Ruby Bridges Goes to School, she recounts, "In 1960, I went to kindergarten in a school for black children. I liked my school, I liked my teacher, I liked my friends. But there was a school for white children even closer to my house than the school for black children." At this time, pressure was being put on schools in New Orleans to take steps towards integration, so a test was administered to black students to gain admittance into all-white schools. The test was designed to be extremely difficult to pass to deter students from gaining the opportunity to go to the previously all-white schools. Ruby Bridges' parents were informed by officials from the NAACP that she was one of only 6 other African American students to pass the test. Ruby would be the only African American student to attend William Frantz Elementary School near her home. However, when the first day of school came in September of that year, the Louisiana State Legislature found ways to fight the federal court order and slow the integration process, and Ruby remained at her old school. These stalling techniques continued until they were exhausted and the legislature had to relent, and in November, the designated schools were to be integrated.
On November 14, 1960, Ruby Bridges arrived at her first day of school at William Frantz Elementary, escorted by 4 federal marshals, by the order of the president, for her safety from the mobs of white segregationist protesters. Every day, people would come to harass, scream, and throw things at Ruby. On her first day at the new school, Ruby recounted thinking that there were so many people and commotion that there was a party, that it was Mardi Gras. She soon realized that this was not at all why the crowds were gathered, and Ruby was forced to pass by barricades and mobs of hostile protesters just to reach the steps of the school building. Ruby and her mother spent that entire first day sitting in the principal's office as angry parents pulled their white children out of school. 500 students were withdrawn. The second day, Ruby was admitted to class, and she and her mother met Barbara Henry, the only teacher willing to teach Ruby. Here, Ruby found out that she was to be the only student in class with Mrs. Henry, and it remained that way for the majority of her first grade year. The third day was the first time she went to school alone, protected by marshals, but without her mother at her new school.
During winter, Ruby at times had trouble sleeping and eating. Whenever she had nightmares, her mother would tell her to pray, which somehow always worked. It made her feel like everything was okay. At school, Ruby had trouble eating because of how lonely she was. She wished that she could eat with the other kids in the cafeteria, and eventually she started hiding her peanut butter sandwiches and milk in an attempt to somehow be allowed to go to the cafeteria. There was even a time that this struggle with eating extended into her home life. She wasn't sure why this was happening, but what she does know is that once the school year was over, she got her appetite back. The worst part for her was the loneliness. I spent the whole year searching for those kids. The few kids that stayed, the principal would hide them so that they would never see me and I would never see them. Mrs. Henry became the closest thing to a friend to Ruby. According to Ruby, I knew if I got safely past the angry crowds outside and into my classroom, I was going to have a good day.
Towards the end of the year, a few white children came back to school. At the time, Ruby still didn't know that much about racism or integration, only what she had heard from adults. She recounted in her book, Through My Eyes, that everything clicked when a boy refused to play with her. At that moment, it all made sense to me. I finally realized that everything had happened because I was black. I remember feeling a little stunned. It was all about the color of my skin. I wasn't angry at the boy because I understood. His mother had told him not to play with me, and he was obeying her. In Ruby's last months of first grade, the marshals stopped escorting, and she was taken to school by a taxi. Starting in second grade, she was on her own. Her new class consisted of at least 20 other kids, a few of whom were black. Her new teacher was different from Mrs. Henry and made fun of Ruby's accent. Ruby had picked up a Boston accent during her time with Mrs. Henry, and because she didn't sound like any of the other kids, she felt different and alone.
In 1960, Barbara Henry moved from Boston to New Orleans with her newly wedded husband. When she applied for a teaching job, she was the only one willing to teach an integrated class, and thus, she became Ruby's teacher. Teachers at William Franz were quitting because they didn't want to teach non-white students. Mrs. Henry created a safe and caring space for Ruby to learn and grow in. Neither of them missed a day of school. I felt safe and loved, and that was because of Mrs. Henry, who, by the way, looked exactly like the women in that screaming mob outside. But she wasn't like them. She showed me her heart, and even at 6 years old, I knew she was different. Barbara Henry was white, and I was black, and we mattered to each other. She became my best friend. Barbara Henry also felt the heat of the protesters. Upon leaving school in the afternoon, even with a police escort, you were always fearful of how the people gathered along the sidewalks might choose to protest that day as you drove past them. The New Orleans police were supposed to be there to help us, but they very much disliked being the ones who enforce integration, so you never could be confident of their support and cooperation. In addition to this stress, the principal at William Franz gave no support either. She was a rigid, prejudiced woman. The other teachers followed suit and shunned Barbara and Ruby. After the year spent with Ruby had expired, the school made it clear that Mrs. Henry was no longer welcome there, so she moved with her husband back to Boston.
Providing for Ruby as parents was tough, as they were met with obstacle after obstacle. Her father could not take her to school nor protect her from the mob since it was not safe for him as a young black man. Despite retaliation, Ruby continued to attend school at William Franz. The local grocery store refused to sell to Ruby's mother. Ruby's father was fired from his job. This put a lot of strain on the family because this was a time when many were not willing to offer jobs to African American veterans like Ruby's father. He received a Purple Heart for bravery in the Korean War. Ruby's parents didn't agree on the decision of enrolling her into William Franz. This tension, along with financial woes, drove a wedge between them, and they divorced when Ruby was in 7th grade. Her mother moved her and her siblings into a housing project, while her father stayed in their old house. He passed away when she was 24. This family faced financial struggles over the next few years, and during this time, she put her faith into praying. She believed that it could get her through anything.
Ruby went on to graduate from an integrated high school. After graduation, Ruby studied travel and tourism and became one of the first African American travel agents at American Express in New Orleans. Ruby worked as a travel agent for the next 15 years and eventually met and married Malcolm Hall. They went on to have 4 sons who attended integrated schools in New Orleans. Ruby returned to William Frantz Elementary School after her youngest brother Milton was killed in a drug-related shooting in 1990. This traumatic event sparked a new sense of purpose in Ruby. She became motivated by her desire to help young people who were in trouble and to bring better opportunities and resources to intercity schools.
At this time, Ruby observed that due to a lack of resources at inner-city schools, it seemed as if schools were being resegregated, as suburban schools had access to resources that inner-city schools did not. This is what led Ruby to establish the Ruby Bridges Foundation in 1999 to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences. The foundation was originally funded by proceeds from the book The Story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles. With these funds, Ruby started after-school enrichment programs on various subjects such as multicultural arts, ballet, African American dance, and manners and etiquette. Her hope was to integrate programs like these into inner-city schools. Since then, 2 elementary schools have been named after Ruby, one in Alameda, California, and another in Woodville, Washington. A statue of Ruby also stands in the courtyard of William Frantz Elementary.
In 1996, Ruby was reunited with her teacher Barbara Henry on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Barbara had found Ruby's book, The Story of Ruby Bridges, and contacted her through her publisher. This reunion was heartfelt and deeply meaningful to both Barbara and Ruby. The two were reunited again after so many years apart. They had both played a huge role in each other's lives so long ago. Then, in 2013, Ruby was reunited with the last surviving Marshall, who originally escorted her up the stairs her first grade year at William Frantz Elementary. As you might imagine, this too was a reunion of a lifetime. On November 14, 2014, they all again reunited at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis for a historic event to commemorate the day Ruby first went to William Frantz. This was the first time Lucille Bridges, Barbara Henry, Charles Burks, and of course Ruby Bridges had been together in more than 5 decades.
Ruby has become a successful author and has published 3 books. The first is an autobiography published in 1999 titled Through My Eyes. In 2000, this book won the Carter G. Woodson Book Award. The second is a children's book published in 2009 titled Ruby Bridges Goes to School, My True Story. Her most recent book was published in 2020 and is a letter to the young people of today titled This Is Your Time. Besides the books that Ruby has written herself, many other authors have published books about her story. At public appearances, Ruby highlights the importance of reading, literacy, and the power of education. When she talks with students, she starts with what the students know about her experiences, whether through school, through her books, or through the Disney movie based on her called Ruby Bridges, and then moves into conversing about their experiences about racial difficulties. Ruby's central message is always that racism has no place in the hearts and minds of our children. When asked about racism, Ruby often responds with the motto one of her sons created that has been the theme of her life. Racism is a grown-up disease. Let's stop using our kids to spread it.
Present day, Ruby is known as a civil rights icon, activist, writer, speaker, and educator. In her words, I chose integration as my life's work because I wanted to do something to try and bridge the gap between our racial divide. She sits as the chair of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, has her own website, rubybridges.com, and is active on her Instagram, Ruby Bridges Official. Ruby Bridges has received many honors and awards for her bravery as a young girl at William Frantz Elementary, as well as all of her contributions since then. On January 8, 2001, Ruby was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by President Bill Clinton, and in November of 2006, She was honored as a hero against racism at the 12th Annual Anti-Defamation League Concert Against Hate. On July 15, 2011, Ruby returned to the White House to meet with President Barack Obama. Standing in front of the Norman Rockwell painting of her on display, he told her, "I think it's fair to say that if it hadn't been for you guys, I might not be here and we wouldn't be looking at this together." In 2017, Ruby was honored as one of Glamour's magazine's Women of the Year. In January of 2021, Ruby attended the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Harris, the first African American Vice President of the United States, and Ruby embraced one another and celebrated the historical occasion taking place.
Ruby has spoken on present-day civil rights issues and the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2005, Ruby suffered the loss of her eldest son, Craig, who was shot while walking on the street while on break from his job on a cruise ship. His untimely and unjust death reminded Ruby why her activism continues to be starkly important and why we as a society need to do more to address and combat inequality. She has found strength and inspiration with those who are standing up in the Black Lives Matter movement. In her interview with Time magazine, she said, "They've taken on this charge. I think the baton has been passed." She says the protests make her hopeful about the future of the US, adding, "I think when we open our doors and we are able to go back out, this world is going to be a different place." Ruby Bridges is known as a 6-year-old who advanced the civil rights movement, but to this day, she continues the fight she unknowingly sparked all those years ago. Her story continues to inspire us. As we've reached the end of this podcast, we'd like to leave you with this quote from Ruby. "May my past, my story, inspire you. The first steps towards change are never easy, but 6-year-old Ruby Bridges taught us that it is necessary to take those steps." Let's continue the legacy that Ruby has started and work together to move towards a better, more just tomorrow.